Today I'm going to be talking about on rereading Pride and Prejudice. So there's something special about Pride and Prejudice. It is reread so often. I've reread it many times, so if many people watching this video will have as well. And it tends, when people start to make a list of the top 100 novels, it's in there, and quite often the top 10, and maybe the top 5, maybe the top 2, repeatedly. So why is that? Why is it so good? And one of the reasons is that I've come across in re-looking at it is that the chapters are so short. Each chapter is just 2 or 3 pages. And so you just say, I'll read the next bit. Oh, I'll just see how this turns out. And she has written a genius way of unraveling the story. So there's always some person, some part of the story that's, you think, what happens next? How does that work out? And you read on. So every July, Booktube, the bookish community on YouTube, springs out in read-alongs and all sorts of books to do with Jane Austen. We celebrate Jane Austen July. And this month, this year, I joined in a read-along with Steve Donoghue and Hannah's Books. And the idea has been to read the book slowly throughout the month. But there's a problem with that and Pride and Prejudice, and that is because it's addictive. And there are reasons for that. So, one of the things I discovered on my reread this time around is that it very much is not just the story of one couple. It's actually got a whole range of variety of couples. And we start off with a failed romance. Chapter 1 has Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, Elizabeth's mum and dad, talking, and we see here a very fragmented relationship. Throughout the book we can see it has failed, and in fact Mr. Bennet is going to say that he was attracted by his wife's beauty. They didn't have much in common, and throughout it all he's retiring to his library to get some peace and quiet. She's all noise and flurry and commotion, and she does have good reasons to be upset. There's a very real chance that she and her daughters are going to end up as homeless and poverty stricken. But that's how we start the novel. Some of the other things I've noticed too is that it's a group story. There are all the various permutations of the different lovers, so to speak, which is Shakespeare was at that a long time before. It's nothing new. But that Jane Austen has chosen to feature her writing and centre it around a small community in a village. She's actually written about that. It's a very well-known quote about how that's all you need to create a great story. And the fact that it's a novel with so many characters means it takes 15 chapters before we've got all the main characters assembled. 15 chapters. And you think sometimes of more contemporary novels that might try and introduce them all in the first 2 or 3 chapters. And so you sometimes hear people reviewing books and novels and saying, oh, there's too many people, it becomes all confusing. But you're not confused because she introduces them gently and you have time to get used to them before and what that means, each person means for that current network of folks. And then somebody new comes in and somebody new and somebody new. So she's a brilliant writer of characters and of a vast ensemble. It also means there's always something new for the first 15 chapters. And then, of course, you're intrigued by the characters. You've got to know them, and you're seeing the various little stories within the story, and you're interested in what's going to happen next. The whole book could have been a tragedy. If you think about it, Mr. Bennet has married his wife. They assumed they would have a son, and the son would inherit the house. And they had a daughter, another child, and a daughter, and so it went on, until there were 5 daughters born, at which point it seemed they just gave up on trying for a son and reconciled themselves to the fact that they would not inherit the house and that it would go to a distant cousin. But Jane Austen has made this a whole comedy of manners, and in fact the cousin comes to visit. Even before he arrives, he writes a very foolish and pompous letter, and it turns out to be exactly like that in person. And he continues writing pompous letters as well, because we're going to get one at the very end of the book, which is key to the whole denouement and how things get resolved. Mr. Collins is unintentionally hilarious because he's over serious. And there's one part at which he has arrived and he is invited to give a reading to the family that evening, bearing in mind there's no TV at the time. He agrees, and then Mr. Bennet gives him a book to read from, and here's where it goes from there. Mr. Collins readily assented, and a book was produced. But on beholding it, for everything announced it to be from a circulating library, he started back, and begging pardon protested that he never read novels. Kitty stared at him, and Lydia exclaimed. Other books were produced, and after some deliberation, he chose Fordyce's Sermons. Lydia gaped as he opened the volume, and there, before he had, with very monotonous solemnity, read 3 pages, she interrupted him with ... So you get, in a sense, the whole humour of Jane Austen pointing out that she's written a novel, but novels are considered to be very, very lowbrow by this particular minister, and so he reads something incredibly boring. And one doubts if that is appropriate reading for young girls, and especially for Kitty and for Lydia, it is falling on deaf ears. There's no way they're going to engage with it. So that's really quite meta. You're looking at a reflection of somebody commenting on the novel within a novel about how it's not fit to be seen, and then acting very serious, very meta. But books actually appear a lot as a subject, and I find that interesting in rereading it, that there are so many direct quotes about books. And of course, without looking too far, you can see that Mr. Bennet uses his library to retire to. But there are also direct comments made about books, and especially by Mr. Darcy, which of course are interesting to us. So it's said that he's a noble and well-stocked library, which is interesting because Jane Austen herself learnt from her father's library. I mean, that was her a main education for her. She went away to girls' schools, and they were, to a variety, not particularly great, and life endangering in others, because they would be a place where disease could break out, and then it would be difficult to be apart from it. So here is Mr. Darcy. Miss Bingley, of course, is trying to flatter him, so here she starts off. What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy. It ought to be good, he replied. It has been the work of many generations. There may be a tinge of pride in that, by the way. And then she comes back. And then you have added so much to it yourself. You are always buying books. And he replies, I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these. And the page following the one where he talks about his library, he talks about the wife that he would like, and adds, all this she must possess, and to all this she must yet add something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. Not just reading, but extensive reading. Which, this is catnip to us on Booktube here. We're just, Mr. Darcy, you are the guy. So a few pages on, surprise, surprise, we find Miss Bingley, who's trying desperately to attract him, pretends to want to read. She sits and reads a book. Mr. Darcy takes up a book, so Miss Bingley follows suit. Miss Bingley's attention was quite as much engaged in watching Mr. Darcy's progress through his book as in reading her own, and she was perpetually either making some inquiry or looking at his page. Can you imagine anything more just deeply frustrating than when you're reading a book and she totally interrupts him all the time? She has no sense of how to woo a reader, does she really? She could not win him, however, to any conversation. He merely answered her question and read on. At length, quite exhausted by the attempt to be amused with her own book, which she had only chosen because it was the second volume of his, she gave a great yawn and said, How pleasant it is to spend an evening in this way. I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. How much sooner one tires of anything than of a book. When I have a house of my own, she's speaking to Mr. Darcy, I shall be miserable if I have not an excellent library. No one made any reply. She then yawned again, threw aside her book, and cast her eyes round the room in quest of some amusement. When hearing her brother mentioning a ball to Miss Bennet, she turned suddenly towards him. So it's pretty amazing. I don't think ladies had instruction in how to woo a rich young book owner and avid reader. Anyway, she's gone about it completely the wrong way. Here's a couple of other points that I kind of noticed more, especially in this rereading. One is family dynamics, and the other is the whole humour, the English humour that's in this book. So the family dynamics I hadn't realised before. I knew that Mr. Bennet really, really liked Lizzie and she was his favourite child, but in this rereading I noticed it was specifically mentioned that she was her mother's least favourite child. I mean, there's a lot of conflict in that. That's an interesting setup to begin with. And the humour. The humour is that sense of putting people in awkward situations. It's the kind of thing that you find a lot in Monty Python and in classic satirical comedy. It's very, very English. Let me give you an example. At one point, Mrs. Bennet has finally realised that her daughter has a chance of marrying Mr. Bingley, so she chooses to talk extremely loudly about it to her daughter, who's beside her, and all her friends. And yet, sitting directly opposite her at the table is Mr. Darcy, who's Mr. Bingley's best friend. And she's boast about how her daughter is definitely going to marry this rich young man, and he hasn't even proposed. And Elizabeth has to listen to all of that. And it's that kind of toe curling sense of, oh no, don't do this. And the situation just continues. That's the English humour of awkwardness and the awkward situation. And Lizzie's mum is also guilty of it again, because she's determined that Mr. Collins will marry Lizzie, and that will then ensure that their house stays in the family ownership, and she will have somewhere to be, and so will her other daughters, and this is a very desired situation. And so Mr. Collins proposes. Elizabeth has the comedy of being the situation and saying no very nicely, and then he thinks that she's going to be looking for further protestations of love and that this is just a ploy and a little coyness, but actually she really wants him to propose again. And he insists and persists and persists. And of course, nothing is further from the truth from Elizabeth, who speaks her mind very plainly. So finally, she manages to get out of the room. She turns him down like a bedspread, so to speak, which, as we would say, firmly rejects him. And her mother immediately rushes into the room and starts to congratulate Mr. Collins on the approaching marriage, because she's so certain it's going to happen. How about that for an awkward situation? Just can't bear to look, kind of awkward, but it's also humorous, and that is part of the English sense of humour. We also have Mr. Bennet making dry, witty comments all throughout, and he teases his wife. He sets her up, pretends he's not going to call Mr. Bingley when of course he is going to, and just all sorts of different things to do with the way things are said. And of course, Jane Austen is at that from the very start with that very famous opening phrase, "It is a truth universally acknowledged. The young man in possession of a fortune must be in want of a wife." And it's just so humorous. It starts off like a very officious statement. It is a truth universally acknowledged, which is the kind of thing that young Mary would say in one of her little sermonising kind of ways. But of course, it's not a truth. It's simply a way of looking at life that's quite common. And yet Jane Austen is putting her finger on a sore point. She is saying this is the way life is, and this is the way life is for women. You either get married and have an establishment and you have a house to be in, or you don't and you have to live in the charity of your relatives. And as you can imagine, if you're somebody who's just expensive to have in the house, to feed and clothe and everything else, that's a bit of a strain on any relationship, especially if your brother or uncle or whoever is already married and has a house of their own and people to look out for. Or the other thing you can do as a young woman that is respectable is to be a governess, in which case you are at the mercy of the children you teach, because you're in a very unpowerful position. And you're living in the days before teaching unions are up and running. The book is an interesting example of a novel where a writer has to be persistent. So Jane Austen wrote it initially as an epistolary novel, i.e. based a lot on letters, and she got turned down, refused. And that is worth bearing in mind if you're a new writer and you feel like you're going to get refused, or you have been refused by a publisher or two. So was Jane Austen. In fact, she never made her living from her pen. She really lived on the charity of her brother. She made some money, but a tiny amount, and it was not a living. And the thing about that being turned down, she went away and she rewrote the book to become more like what it is now. She revised it, she revised it, she revised it. And remember, this is before the typewriter has been invented. So to write and rewrite, you're doing it by hand. And if you rewrite a novel, you're really going to have to love every single word to make it worth writing down again for the 8th time, the 9th time, the 10th time. And in fact, I know that Aaron Sorkin, who wrote West Wing and various other films and television series, will write a scene and then he will rewrite it from memory, because he believes that what he remembers is going to be the strongest parts of it. And he tends not to look at what he's written before, but in rewrites, he tends to start again. And I think that's why his writing is so amazing. I love West Wing, and it's something that bears rewatching. And similarly for Jane Austen as well. And I think probably in terms of editing, if you've written something and you're thinking, can I make it any better or stronger, and you find it hard to cross out words and chop out things that took a long time to write, try rewriting it all without editing it on the computer, where you have to write out every word that you're going to have in the next version. And I think along the way you'll find lots of parts that don't need to be said or aren't so screamingly funny or wonderfully perceptive that you absolutely must sit for another 5 minutes and write with your wrist aching. So that's a wee tip for editing. Something that Jane Austen does, which keeps the whole story alive, is that she builds an expectation and then pulls the rug out from underneath you as a reader. So for example, in the early part of the novel, we begin to think Mr. Bingley's going to propose and that this is going to be the family all set up for life and it's going to be all sorted out. And then he just moves away without proposing, with no given reason why. Mr. Wickham turns up and it reveals that Mr. Darcy has treated him badly. And this starts to build. Will she have a romance with Mr. Wickham? This is what it seems to be. No, the regiment moves away. It seems that the proposed plan by Mrs. Bennet is that Mr. Collins will marry one of the daughters of the house. And in fact, this is Mr. Collins' stated intent in coming to stay with him in the first place. He's going to marry one of the daughters and the house will stay in the family. No, he doesn't. He marries Charlotte. And when you read back, you realise how businesslike Charlotte is about marriage, the whole process, and that she's plans. Charlotte Lucas. Charlotte Lucas jumps out at me on rereading the book. She's 27 years old. She's pretty much getting to be on the shelf. And she's described as being, quote, sensible, intelligent young woman. and she's a great friend of Lizzie Bennet's. She's incredibly pragmatic. In chapter 6, she gives a masterclass on how to snag a man, and Elizabeth says to her, "Oh yes, but you wouldn't actually do it." She laughs at her, but actually she will. Charlotte is just about to do that very thing, and she's about to put into practice all her theories of how to get a man and encourage him and get married, and then find out about him later on. There's a nice little irony in the story that Elizabeth refuses Mr. Collins, and he thinks she wants another repeated offer of marriage, and she says no, that she's not that kind of a woman, that she's not going to turn down a man, in the hopes that he will then be even more violently in love with her and give her a second offer of marriage. But the irony is that we know later on that she will turn down Mr. Darcy, and then turn around and want him to propose to her again. So there's always little ironies that are placed in the plot, and once you've read the book, it means that when you are reading them, you know what's coming next, you know what's coming later on, and you find the humour in that. And it's like the novelist is having a little joke with you as the reader. I noticed some interesting quotes about the whole subject of life in the country. And Jane Austen famously said that that was what you needed for a book, just to have a few characters in a village, a few families rather, in a village, and that would give you enough story and plot line to keep you writing a book. And there's interesting quotes in Pride and Prejudice itself. Now they're going to occur in chapter 9, and it's between Darcy and Elizabeth, and here's what they say. And he is saying that country life is too quiet. The country, said Darcy, can in general supply but few subjects for such a study. In a country neighbourhood you move in a very confined and unvarying society. To which Elizabeth says, but people themselves alter so much that there is something new to be observed in them forever. And of course the characters change a lot during the course of the novel, and especially Elizabeth and Darcy themselves. They're quite young, they're in their early 20s, and they're still growing up and becoming who they're going to be as adults. I think that scene is also interesting, where Mr. Darcy says something and Elizabeth replies with insight, wit and intelligence and wisdom, and that this is unusual for him, we can see in the book, because we can see Miss Bingley being all about, oh Mr. Darcy, you're so wonderful, oh Mr. Darcy, all this kind of complimentary stuff. And he will make comments and that end a conversation. For example, somebody says to him that, oh, it's wonderful to have a ball because it's such a civilised thing to do together. And his comment is simply to say, any savage can dance. And that's the end. And if you think about conversation as being like tennis, he is used to serving or giving a reply and the ball does not come back over the net. But when he's talking to Elizabeth Bennet, the ball comes back over the net, returned with force, all the strength of what he said returned with her spin on the ball, coming back at him with great force.
It's a stunning shot, stunning rally.
And because of that, they tend to have longer and longer conversations, and there's little flirtatiousness. And in a sense, Lizzie has learnt to be witty and dry and smart, quipping in the way that her father does. Only that hasn't worked in the relationship because Mrs. Bennet has not returned the ball over the net. She's been too busy trying to look pretty on the other side. But Elizabeth can hold her own with Darcy in the realm of thinking and speaking and challenging thought in a witty way. Some of this is what makes the characters interesting. You see a line and you can guess who said it. So I'm going to put in a few quotes here on the screen and see if you can guess who each person is. And she writes about them so beautifully that you can see the words on the page and you know which character is talking. The way they speak is so distinctive. That's a great sign of someone who can write conversation excellently. And that's my thoughts on Volume 1 of Pride and Prejudice, on rereading Pride and Prejudice. I'm interested in knowing what you think of it as you reread it.